stand shoulder to shoulder with coal mines. A former centre of steel production for the Soviet Empire, heavy industry is everywhere in Donetsk. Its factories still supply the nation.
We have worked hard our entire lives. We continue to produce things, but the people over in the capital are just paid to carry out a revolution.
Now more than ever, certain locals say they are favourable to the country being split up.
I think that federalism or autonomy for some regions might be the best solution for Ukraine, because nobody wants a war between the West and the East.
The industrial sprawl of Donetsk is barely 100 kilometres away from the Russian border. The region only accommodates a tenth of the whole Ukrainian population, but it produces 25% of the country's wealth. In the city centre, there are gleaming luxury cars and a brand new football stadium. At the beginning of the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, several Ukrainian entrepreneurs flourished. Now millionaires, close to Yanukovych and his political movement, the Party of the Regions. With the recent ousting of their leader, these pro-Russian politicians think the interim president's move towards Europe is a mistake.
Imagine you have two neighbours, one on the right, one on the left. Are you going to be friends with one and an enemy of the other? That would just be stupid.
Russia's Prime Minister has already said that he doubts the legitimacy of his new neighbour and calls the West's recognition of the revolution an aberration.
Arnaud Danjean, what would you answer to that member of parliament there?
The guy who said that having a neighbor on the right and a neighbor of the left and you do not have to choose is fully right. Ukraine doesn't have to choose between Europe and Russia. Ukraine is Ukraine. It's independent, sovereign, and it can have good relation with both neighbors, EU and Russia. And what EU proposed last November, it was not taking over Ukraine. It was signing a kind of a partnership agreement, which was a trade and investment pact. It was nothing more. And who turned us with hostility against Ukraine? It was Russia, not EU. The offer of the EU was not a contradiction with Ukraine still working with Russia. So I think it's a rather bizarre presentation that offering a trade pact to a country such as Ukraine, independent country, would be an act of hostility towards Moscow. It's rewriting the history.
All right, we have a viewer telling us your debate is biased. You're ignoring the Russian point of view. Dmitry Babich, let me ask you to respond to what Arnaud Danjean just said.
Can I just respond to the line that I heard here at last?
Go ahead, Dmitry.
First, Mr. Danjean lied when he said that the Russian representative signed this agreement, so-called agreement. It was only signed by the German, the French, and the Polish foreign minister. The Russian representative never signed it. This is the first lie. The second lie is that agreement, this association agreement, that Yanukovych did not sign in November. That was a partnership agreement with Russia. It was not the case. And Yanukovych did not cancel that agreement. He just asked to postpone it for financial reasons. And that was enough to provoke the ire of the European Union. So that the European Union did not do anything to guarantee this agreement. That was signed last week. And now we have a seizure of power.
You're saying it's a seizure of power. Dmitry Babich, though.
That people were trying glory to heroes, glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes. He might not know it, but this is the slogan of Ukrainian Nazi collaborators of 1941 to help Hitler to take the war and other parts of Western Ukraine when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union in 1941. These people destroyed all the posts in Lviv. And if they had won, Mr. Danjean and me myself, we wouldn't be sitting here talking now. So everything that happened was just a terrible coup d'etat. And the reason why so few people support Yanukovych now is very simple. People are afraid. because as Mr. Valentin Yasinchuk from Kiev rightly said, the majority of these so-called protesters who now hold real power in Ukraine, they have national socialist views, as he rightly said.
A majority of them?
To present the situation.
Some of them also have peasant socialist views, so we know what it means. I'm afraid it explains why so few people are actually ready to speak out against this new power, against this new government.
All right, Irina Listopad, it is true that the far right, the nationalist right, is part of the movement that's been in Independence Square the past 3 months. But how much do they represent the opposition?
No, I don't think that it's the very important part of the movement. Well, first of all, when we applicate the notion of the right and the left to politics, we can't applicate it in the same way to all the country. And when we're talking about Ukrainian radical rights, it's not like French radical rights who protect the people who have money. In Ukraine, you are right if you protect in Ukrainian language, for example. It's your ideology, it's your native country, but you can be poor at the same time. And yes, in this contradiction between European Union and Russia, there is always some people who is for Ukrainian and who think that Ukrainian and European Union will be could keep their values as Ukrainian and to opposite itself to Russian culture. And these people were on the Maidan, but I don't think that it's the most important things. The most important things of the Maidan is, of course, this to stop the corruption. It was a movement that resembles a lot, that looks like a lot of occupied Times Square, because the people also fight contra against the rich people who gave their money from our money, from the money we bought, from our imports, from the corruption that in the country. That's what they fight for, and it's not the radical nationalists as they could be seen from Russia. And I want to talk about that person who tell that we make not a lot of attention on the Russia. I remind you that we have all other neighbors in Ukraine. I mean, Poland, Belarus, Moldova, Romania, Hungary. And so if there is Ukrainian, European Union and all this country, why should we care about our one neighbor more than about other? So let's ask our neighbor other neighbor what they think about.
Ask the other neighbors outside of just Russia, but nonetheless, Valentin Yanukovych, in the past we've seen that the Russian government upped the ante at times, the cutting, for instance, of natural gas. What do you see as the next step, the next reaction out of Moscow?
Mm-hmm. Okay, may I ask to the same questions which my colleagues answered, because I think in some aspects they were too ideologized, like a Russian colleague, or somehow naive as my Ukrainian colleague. So as to the essence of the present Ukrainian revolution, I may say that it's anti-oligarchic, anti-corruption, anti-Russian nationalistic revolution. And the naive pro-European slogans will be tested soon. And in this case, it's very important to make it not only academic, not only ideological, but professional area of discussion. And I would like to ask researchers and serious politicians, not ideologized in the West, in France, in Britain especially, to analyze why it happened, why this tragedy in Ukraine has happened. You tried to blame Russia. Why you do blame only one side? Start with what happened in the beginning. The contents of the agreement, association agreement, what it contained. I don't want to be ideologized. I just ask your researchers. For example, let us ask Mrs. Marine Le Pen and her experts. She will not be allied to any of French political parties. To read the text and say it was a trap for Ukrainian economy and for Ukrainian leadership. Leadership was absolutely pro-European. Yeah? Mr. Yanukovych has betrayed all his promises to Russia and to Russian-speaking people here. I can develop on this, but it's not the time. He wanted from Europe two things. Yeah, to let his regime exist, don't touch him, do not let Yulia Tymoshenko leave from prison or hospital. And the second, he wanted European financial aid. Europe was very greedy, was giving only $600 million during long period when Ukraine urgently needed much more. And also, 1 week before signing the agreement, he and his prime minister read and understood what risks are there. You know, there was between us experts here discussion that it's dangerous. Something is really illusionary. European used Ukrainian experts who were more pro-European than pro-national. I would like to ask European experts, let us start from the beginning. Please, let us do this research, because if with this kind of policy, you can lead not only to the situation which is in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's the same kind of agreement. Nothing happened. Deindustrialization of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Did you want to have the same in eastern and southern Ukraine, which is still industrialized, not post-industrial, but industrialized? Western and central Ukraine, in many aspects, is already deindustrialized and is ready just that the West comes and arranges here. They are not ready to introduce changes. The government was brainless, not ready to any serious policies, like in Britain, for example. I did research on this. I have a lot of British friends. I know that they have white paper, green paper, it's analyzed. Not here. The Ukrainian government said, we do not have plan B, only signing the agreement. And then there is frustration for all the people. If 1 week before signing, he said, no, we can't. What's that? It's stupidity of the government. It's European trap. It's trap not for Ukraine, for Europe as well. You have created the problem here of civil war, and now we have the results. And it's not the end. Much more difficult problems may arise.
Right, let me get the reaction of the rest of the panel on this. Arnaud Danjean.
With due respect, this agreement has been negotiated for 5 years. It did not happen overnight in Vilnius. 5 years of negotiation. So I'm sorry, but if during the 5 years the Ukrainian experts, so-called experts, were not able to realize if there was a trap or not, it shows afterwards that they were really stupid. Because 5 years of negotiation, yes, you have the time to realize. And I don't think...
No, they were serving other interests.
5 years of negotiation.
They were serving interests of another side.
And let me tell you, I don't see any point with a comparison of Bosnia-Herzegovina and Ukraine. Absolutely no point. So we never signed any agreement with Bosnia-Herzegovina, by the way. So I would like to stop to have this kind of easy comparison, projection, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Libya. What are we talking about? We're talking about Ukraine in the 21st century. We're not talking about Ukraine and Soviet Union in 41. I heard from Moscow this comparison of 41. What does it mean? But using also the same rhetorics as in the 30s, where all the Soviet enemies were fascists. Is it a way to look? Is it a way to look really at the reality today?
West Ukrainians, indeed, a lot of them supported the Nazis, and it was not just any kind of enemy of the Soviet Union.
I know that the Russian power loves to categorize people. You have fascists on the one hand, anti-fascists on the other one. It's not the reality of the world today.
He suggested trilateral negotiations between the European Union, Moscow and Kiev. And it was Mr. Barroso of the European Commission who refused to have these trilateral negotiations. He said that we're only going to talk to Kiev. So there were 3 no's from the European Union. No trilateral negotiations with Ukraine and Russia. Not a single word could be changed in the agreement, and not a single euro would be given to Ukraine to alleviate the pains from reform that would ensue from this association agreement.
Dmitry Babich, let's talk about the present. The German foreign minister warning that a bankrupt Ukraine would be quote, too big a burden for either Russia or the EU to bear. Can Russia and Brussels still work together?
I think, of course, they can, but there is a subjective factor. The European Union uses anti-Russian rhetoric for many years now, and when Yanukovych suggested just having a talk, he didn't suggest any concrete proposal. He just suggested that Brussels, Moscow, and Kiev should talk to each other. The European deputies, including people like Elmar Brok, responded that it's going to be a bilateral agreement between Ukraine and the European Union. Russia has nothing to do with it. But this is plainly wrong, because Russia already has a free trade zone with Ukraine. So if this association agreement had been signed, Ukraine would have a free trade zone with the European Union and with Russia. This is something Russia cannot afford, because then the European goods would be sold customs-free all the way to Vladivostok. This is the reason why this agreement was so bad for Russia, and why Russia started to build a real border with Ukraine for objective reasons, because we did not agree to have a free trade zone with the European Union. We agreed only to have a free trade zone with Ukraine. But this border was interpreted by the European Union as pressure on Ukraine, as terrible crime by Vladimir Putin. And we had this propaganda campaign which reached its peak just recently when European politicians and European newspapers accused Vladimir Putin for the violence that happened in Kiev. This is absolutely absurd.
All right.
Well, we understand that Russia is a poor, lonesome victim of all the world against Russia. Let's be frank, and let's be not so caricatural. I mean, there are talks between Russia and the EU. There are every 6 months summit. So we have time to discuss. We have plenty of occasions to discuss. What was at stake this time was a deal with Ukraine negotiated for 5 years. If the Ukrainians finally decided it was not in their interest to sign, fine, okay. But it happened after also a kind of a blackmail from Moscow. And it happened with other countries. It happened with Armenia a few months ago, exactly the same way. So you cannot make as if everybody discovered that overnight in Vilnius. It was a long process. Everything was on the table. There was no hidden plan or whatsoever. So I think Russia, which is a very important partner, which is a very important interlocutor, we have to talk together. We have to negotiate. But negotiation doesn't mean giving up to blackmail all the time. And it doesn't mean that Russia should be playing the victim all the time of a worldwide plot of fascists. And I don't like this rhetoric like Russia is besieged by old fascists and 41 fascists in Ukraine. It's ridiculous. It's not the reality of today's world.
All right. Earlier, the Russian Foreign Ministry denouncing, quote, dictatorial and sometimes terrorist methods, a statement echoed by the Prime Minister himself.
Those agreements that consist of binding responsibilities will be fulfilled. We are neighbours, close nations, and we cannot avoid each other. Everything that has been signed has to be implemented, but strictly speaking today, we don't have anyone to negotiate with. There is no government in Ukraine. The legitimacy of the entire governmental machine that exists there raises big doubts.
All right. Despite after the rhetoric, Irina, what do you think will be Moscow's reaction? What is Moscow going to do?
Well, I just hope that there will be no force from the Moscow, no army. I just hope, and I beg the Russian politicians don't do that, because we just had such a big...
Would you think that's a real possibility?
Well, actually, before it happened, before this 100 deaths in Ukraine, I didn't believe that it could happen, but unfortunately, it happened. And by the way, it's nice to hear about dictatorship from our Russian colleagues.
Dmitry Babich, how do you see Moscow's reaction? What would be the appropriate response from Moscow to what's unfolding?
Well, if you listened well to what the Prime Minister Medvedev had to say, it was actually very mild, and he did not say anything about any economic sanctions or any punishments, which makes him very different from the EU, which immediately started threatening sanctions after Yanukovych refused or postponed signing the deal that they wanted from him. So basically, I think that Russia's position was very moderate, very mild. Not a single Russian official came to Kiev to pressure Yanukovych since November, although Catherine Ashton and other European politicians spent days and nights in Kiev, and Victoria Nuland from the State Department fed cookies to these so-called protesters. What Russia can do is just to give political asylum to some people from eastern Ukraine and from the Ukrainian government who may face this so-called revolutionary justice now in Ukraine. I absolutely exclude that there will be any military action. I think that we are certainly not an epitome of democracy, but at least we don't interfere into the affairs of other nations in the same way as the EU did in this particular case. I think that what Russia did in December when it offered economic aid to Ukraine, it offered to buy Ukrainian government bonds. So to say that this is pressure is basically preposterous. Russia also buys American government bonds, and China buys American government bonds, but it doesn't mean that Russia and China are pressuring American government.
All right, but I won't go over the import tariffs that were a few months back, as well as the issues in the past with cutting the gas. But let me ask about the EU's response.
It's very easy to explain, because according to this association agreement, Ukraine was going to have a free trade zone with the EU. And we before had a free trade zone with Russia. So we increased these tariffs because there was a possibility that Ukraine would open itself to the European Union and there would be no border between us and the European Union. That was a legitimate concern. As for the gas, you know that Ukraine didn't pay for it for many years, and a lot of this gas that was actually destined for Western Europe disappeared on the Ukrainian territory. This continued for decades.
All right, let me ask quickly about the West's response, because we're running short on time. Arnaud Danjean, the acting finance minister of Ukraine, says they need 35 billion euros fast. $35 billion, excuse me. The spokesperson for the German government saying it's through the IMF that we have to do this now. How are we going to be able to stave off bankruptcy here?
Well, I think there is also a lot of dramatization. It's like overnight Ukraine will get bankrupt. The crisis in Ukraine is not a new thing. The economical and financial crisis, it's part of the reason why people protested. Because of this system, this rotten economic system, for many years, and even probably before Yanukovych. He's not the only one guilty in that. But let me be clear about these sanctions we were just talking about. EU has never talked about sanctions because of Ukraine not signing the association deal. These sanctions were only mentioned and threatened after there was the clashes which left 70 people dead, and these people were shot at by government forces. It was only last Thursday that sanctions were. There was no sanction. There was no sanction at all before. There was no sanctions at all discussed before that. Never. So it's not true to say that EU would have sanctioned Ukraine if Ukraine did not sign the deal. Ukraine did not sign the deal, actually. And there was no sanction from EU. We said, okay, you don't want to sign the deal. It's still on the table. If you want to sign it, come back to us. If you don't, you don't. And that's what happened.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. There's a lot more to talk about, but I want to thank our panel. I want to thank Arnaud Danjean, Irina Listopad, Dmitry Babich for joining us from Moscow, and from Kiev, Valentin Yakushuk. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
It was signing a kind of a partnership agreement, which was a trade and investment pact. It was nothing more. And who turned with hostility against Ukraine? It was Russia, not EU. The offer of the EU was not a contradiction with Ukraine still working with Russia. So I think it's a rather bizarre presentation that offering a trade pact to a country such as Ukraine, independent country, would be an act of hostility towards Moscow.
The regions. With the recent ousting of their leader, these pro-Russian politicians think the interim president's move towards Europe is a mistake.
Imagine you have two neighbours, one on the right, one on the left. Are you going to be friends with one and an enemy of the other? That would just be stupid.
Russia's prime minister has already said that he doubts the legitimacy of his new neighbour and calls the West's recognition of the revolution an aberration.
Arnaud Danjean, what would you answer to that member of parliament there?
The guy who said that having a neighbor on the right and a neighbor of the left, and you do not have to choose, is fully right. Ukraine doesn't have to choose between Europe and Russia. Ukraine is Ukraine. It's independent, sovereign, and it can have good relation with both neighbors, EU and Russia. And what EU proposed last November, it was not taking over Ukraine.
Because nobody wants a war between the West and the East.
The industrial sprawl of Donetsk is barely 100 kilometers away from the Russian border. The region only accommodates a tenth of the whole Ukrainian population, but it produces 25% of the country's wealth. In the city centre, there are gleaming luxury cars and a brand new football stadium. At the beginning of the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, several Ukrainian entrepreneurs flourished. Now millionaires, close to Yanukovych and his political movement, the party stand shoulder to shoulder with coal mines. A former centre of steel production for the Soviet Empire, heavy industry is everywhere in Donetsk. Its factories still supply the nation.
We have worked hard our entire lives. We continue to produce things, but the people over in the capital are just paid to carry out a revolution.
Now more than ever, certain locals say they are favourable to the country being split up.
I think that federalism or autonomy for some regions might be the best solution for Ukraine.